Thank you for joining today's webinar. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that were being produced by the International Rescue Committee with the support of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And this is done as part of the Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Assistance Project, which we're referring to as META. META is focused on building the capacity of refugee service providers in the U.S. to collect, manage, analyze, and use quality data to improve outcomes for the clients that we all serve. Today's session is going to focus on project design processes to provide a good foundation for monitoring and evaluation. Is everyone able to hear me okay? All right. So I am Jaime Costigan. I am the M&E Technical Advisor for the META project and for IRC's U.S. programs. We also have with us today Meg Gibbon, who is the META Program Manager. And I'm also pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Kasia Kedzia, who is Director of Evaluation at LIRS. Kasia brings 10 years of experience in performance management and capacity building in developing countries, and her work has focused largely on training and providing direct support to clients in the areas of results-oriented management and development of program and project-level performance management plans. Currently at LIRS, Kasia is designing a results-oriented organization-wide monitoring and evaluation system, as well as business processes to inform staff, management, the board of directors, and other stakeholders about LIRS outcomes and impact. And so she'll be talking to us a little bit about that work at LIRS today. So to give you an overview of today's webinar, today we'll first go through a few WebEx logistics. Then I want to go over a few key M&E terms, and then we will talk about 2 M&E standards related to project design, and I will provide some tips for putting in place a solid foundation for good monitoring and evaluation. And then we're going to hear from Kasia on practical examples of how monitoring and evaluation is integrated into program design processes at LIRS. Then we ask at the end that you provide your feedback. We'll have a link to a survey just so we can make modifications to future webinars. So to get started, I'll hand over to Meg.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the call today. I'll just spend a brief minute here going over the WebEx forum to let you know everyone is muted who's joined the call, but we'd welcome any questions that you have. So you can please feel free to type those questions to the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the call. There's also the option to do a hand raise. Anyone having issues connecting can also feel free to chat me privately, and we'll try to get the audio dialed in. The event info tab in the top left of your screen will have the dial-in information for those using a phone. If you'd like to view the presentation in full screen, you can click View and select Full Screen at the very top. The chat bubble I mentioned is on the top right of your screen, and we'll also have a poll a little bit later on in the presentation. That'll appear as a pop-up window, and you can click Submit when you've chosen your answer. In full screen, same goes for the chat bubble, and the pop-up poll will appear in that view as well. If you'd like to return to the previous view, you can click the blue Return button in the top left. So I'll give it back over to Jaime to get started on the content.
Great, thanks, Meg. So for those of you who didn't attend the last webinar, I want to do a quick review of what we're talking about when we're talking about monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring is the process of regularly and systematically collecting, managing, and analyzing information about a project in order to adjust or shape project implementation as needed. In analyzing project monitoring data on an ongoing basis, program staff should be asking questions related to project progress and also implementation processes. So for example, questions related to progress might be questions like, are we meeting our targets and benchmarks? And then questions related to implementation processes might include things like what project activities are being implemented, Are they being implemented as planned? Are we reaching the people that we're intending to reach with the intended services? And then why or why not? And again, as part of the monitoring, this questioning, this analysis is done as part of ongoing project monitoring. And you'll note here that when we're talking about project monitoring, we're not talking about the monitoring that's done by headquarters to monitor compliance or the monitoring that's done by donors to monitor compliance. What we're talking about is the project monitoring that's done by project teams on an ongoing basis to assess project progress and implementation processes and to really make adjustments as needed to the project. Evaluation is the process of collecting and analyzing information, typically once or twice during a project, after a completed project or project phase, in order to assess a project or program's outcomes and the factors that influence results. So the questions that evaluations might look at include questions like, related to outcomes, for example, that might be things like, did we see the changes we expected to see? Or they might be questions related to impact. So did our interventions work, and can we say that these changes can be attributed to our program? Evaluations might also look at questions related to implementation processes. So questions like, what factors influenced the project results? Was the theoretical basis of the project sound? Were project activities implemented as planned? Was the project cost efficient? Was it cost effective? Did we reach who we intended to reach overall throughout the project with the intended services? And then if not, why not? So it's really looking back on the project. Effective monitoring and evaluation begins with good project design processes. Before you can think about what you want to measure, you really need to be thinking about why you will, where you're going, what you want to achieve through your project, and also how you'll get there, so how you'll achieve the outcomes you want to achieve. You also need to be thinking about what you want to learn about your project along the way. Good monitoring and evaluation really requires having a cleared roadmap that shows you and the team that's implementing the project what you want to achieve and then how you're going to, what you're going to do to achieve it. Ideally, developing this roadmap would happen at the project design phase, so before you're in the process of writing proposals. But for ongoing programs, which I know that many of us who are involved in providing services domestically here to refugees have ongoing programs with ongoing funding. For these programs, this is still a relevant process. So the planning, the thinking about what we want to achieve and how we'll get there can happen at any point in time in the project when there's a recognized need to make space to map out what the project strategy is or to improve our project monitoring and evaluation. So some opportunities for this might be during strategic planning processes or in preparation for a new funding period, for example. So on the Meta website, you can find a set of monitoring and evaluation standards that we have proposed to help refugee service providers improve their monitoring and evaluation processes. Because of how important project design is to monitoring and evaluation, the first and really foundational standard that we have included is ensuring that project strategies have clearly articulated objectives and logical causality. The second M&E standard that we propose related to project design is to make sure that monitoring and evaluation plans are in place and that they are appropriate and that they're adequately resourced. You can find the standards and benchmarks on the Meta website, as I mentioned, on the standards page. There's also an organizational assessment and action planning tool there that you can download. But rather than just go through each of these benchmarks that's listed here on the slide, I want to instead just highlight 8 actionable tips that you can follow to meet the 2 standards that we've proposed here, and really help your organization to put in place a solid foundation for good monitoring and evaluation. So tip number 1 is to get familiar with logic models, which would include both log frames and theories of change, and how they can benefit you. I'm going to open a quick poll here, because I want to get an understanding a little bit of how familiar you are with theories of change and log frames, just so I know if this is a basic review or if this is introduction of a few new terms. So I'm opening the poll now. Go ahead and just indicate how familiar you are with these terms. I'll give it just a minute to get the results in. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And I'm sharing the poll results. I don't know if everybody can see this, but there's a real mixture here. Most people seem to be somewhat familiar with the terms, but there's some who are not familiar at all. So great. Hopefully this will be a refresher for many of you, and that it will help those of you who are not familiar with these terms to gain some of that familiarity. So logic models, the term logic model has been used to use kind of interchangeably with multiple terms. It's been used interchangeably with log frames. It's been used interchangeably with theories of change. So, there's no agreement on set definitions. But in my view, I would say that logic models, the theories of change and log frames are both two types of logic models. They are visual depictions of what the outcomes are that you want to see through your project, and they underline how you're going to get there. I should note that LIRS, as Kasia will talk about, uses the term results framework, which is from USAID, to describe what we're talking about here in this diagram of the theory of change. Theories of change diagrams can be either basic or they can be more complex, as shown here. The one on the left, which is a basic theory of change, is sometimes referred to as a results chain. But theories of change can also be more complex as those on the right-hand side. They aren't necessarily linear. Theories of change diagrams explicitly illustrate the causal pathways between activities, outputs, outcomes, and objectives. The process of developing a theory of change is one that's really useful in helping to make sure that the causal relationships between your activities, your outputs, your outcomes, your objectives, to make sure that causal relationship and that causal pathway is really logical. Theories of change diagrams can also be more refined. They can include assumptions and risks, as well as indicators. But even if a theory of change diagram doesn't include these, the process of developing a theory of change really should involve collaborative team discussion around what assumptions are being made and how the results will be measured. They shouldn't necessarily be developed by a technical advisor or someone who's developing a proposal sitting in headquarters. It should really be a collaborative discussion. It provides an opportunity to discuss what you want to achieve, make sure that you have a shared vision, what assumptions and risks you're making, and then how you go about measuring it. Ideally, theory of change diagrams should also be accompanied by a narrative or a statement that provides a summary of the theory of change, articulating what change will occur, for whom, and then how the assumptions, what change will occur and for whom and how, but also what the assumptions are being made and how those will be addressed. Log frames are a table or a matrix that summarizes the key elements of a project strategy. So it includes your project objectives, your outcomes, your outputs, your activities, as well as your indicators, which are how you'll measure, the means of verification, so the sources of the data, and then any assumptions that you're making. Log frames are a project management tool. They tell you clearly what you intend to achieve, as well as how you'll go about measuring it, and how you'll know that you've achieved it to the quality needed to produce the outcomes that you expect. Tip number 2 is illustrate your theory of change before developing a log frame in order to articulate what you want to achieve, what you'll do to get there, and make sure that the causal relationship between your activities, outputs, outcomes, and objectives is logical. Now, this is important because oftentimes people are jumping right into developing the log frame, or in some cases, it's even worse, where they're just starting with developing a project narrative. They're just writing the project narrative, and then they're following that by developing a log frame. And one of the risks with this is that you lose that causality, and sometimes the logic that should be inherent in your log frame is not there. So one way that you can avoid that is to start your project design processes by illustrating your theory of change. It can also help your teams to make sure that they're identifying where they're making real leaps of faith, or where there are also key missing steps in the change process, or also where there are assumptions being made that might be what could be termed killer assumptions, where you actually need to be developing some activities to make sure that those assumptions actually are coming true or are actually realized. Tip number 3 is, where possible, make sure that your theory of change is based on existing evidence and data. In some cases, there may be evidence that certain interventions are effective in achieving the outcomes you want to achieve. Sometimes there's not, but many cases, and increasingly, there is evidence for the types of activities that we would want to be implementing to achieve outcomes for our clients. Where this evidence does exist, it should really be taken into consideration in developing your theories of change. Existing data should also be used. So this data might come, for example, from needs assessments or from public statistics or reports. And all of this, the identifying the data that could be supporting your project design, as well as any evidence that's available to support your project design. All of this, it makes sure that your program is responsive to the needs of clients and to your context, but it can also help you to write stronger proposals. And then where you're seeing evidence gaps, this can inform your research agenda if your organization is indeed engaged in doing research. Before developing a log frame that outlines what data you'll collect, it can be helpful to ask what we want to learn from a project. So this is tip number 4, consider what you want to learn. Maybe you want to learn on an ongoing basis about whether or not you're reaching the intended target population. Maybe you want to know whether your services are timely and valued, or whether they're accessible to everyone, including women and girls. Or maybe you want to learn about the impact of your project compared to no intervention. Or maybe you want to learn whether the project is on track and being implemented as planned, or whether you're achieving the outcomes that you said you were wanting to achieve. Outlining what you want to learn from your project can help you to identify the right indicators to include in your log frame and your monitoring and evaluation plans, as well as the right methods to use. And it can also help you to identify which resources you need to budget for. Now, not all donors require that log frames be in place, but my tip number 5 would be to develop a log frame even if the donor doesn't require it. And this is because it's just good practice. It can make things easier for you to set up your monitoring and evaluation and performance management systems. It can also make sure that everyone in your program team is able to communicate effectively about what you're trying to achieve and consistently about what you're trying to achieve and how you're achieving it and how you're going to be measuring achievement. It'll also help people to understand why they're collecting the data that they're collecting. Log frames are just essentially, they're very useful project management tools that if done effectively, can really help you guide your project management. Now, indicators should also be smart and purposeful. So it's not just good enough to have indicators included in your log frame, they need to be smart and purposeful. Meta's smart indicator has a smart indicator checklist that's available on the website that I encourage you all to check out It can be very helpful in helping you to consider whether or not your indicators are smart. But indicators should also, as mentioned here, be purposeful. So thinking through during the design process, how the indicators will be used. Not just are they smart, so are they measurable, are they specific, are they time-bound, et cetera, but also are they purposeful? Are they indicators that will serve a programmatic purpose? Making sure that they actually have a purpose that's stated. I mean, sometimes the purpose is just because you need to report it to donors, but in other cases, you should have indicators that also serve a role that you'll use to monitor the extent to which your program is that you're delivering quality services, for example, and achieving what you want. And doing this can really help to lead to better use of staff time and better use of project data, because you can measure a lot of things, but if we're not using that data to improve programs, then there's really a lost opportunity there, and so we can get better with that. So that's tips number 6. Tip number 7. Make sure that you plan appropriate resources, both human and financial, that are required to carry out your M&E plans. So as I mentioned earlier, ideally the development of theories of change and so ideally you should be doing this in the beginning. Sometimes we're doing this retroactively. A general rule for monitoring and evaluation is that when you're planning your project in the early design processes, your monitoring evaluation activities should make up 10% of your budget. We should be making sure that we have budgeted for an adequate number of staff to collect and enter and analyze data on a regular basis, as well as sometimes for staff to provide oversight of data quality and monitoring and evaluation activities. You should also consider budgeting for training to equip staff with the capacity to carry out their monitoring and evaluation responsibilities, consultant fees and expenses that are required for external evaluations. And then also some other things you might want to consider budgeting for would include equipment and software required for M&E activities, translation and piloting of M&E tools, and then also like communication costs, including mobile data, copy editing, formatting, printing of final evaluations, any type of dissemination activities you might want to do. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the theories of change in log frames should be done during project design, ideally, but it is still really useful to go through the process of developing theories of change in log frames, even if your projects have already been ongoing and you have strict donor-determined activities and strict donor reporting requirements. You can do this as part, like I mentioned, of the annual planning processes. You can do it at the end of a program year or in preparation for new funding requests. Developing theories of change in log frames for ongoing projects and programs, it can really help you to think through it can help you to think beyond donor requirements to what outcomes you want to achieve for your clients and what you want to learn about your projects on an ongoing basis to improve the quality of services. So all of these tips I leave to you to think about. We do have a tip sheet that Meg will direct you to at the end. But now I want to hand over to Kasia, who's going to talk a little bit about monitoring and evaluation processes at LIRS.
Thanks, Jaime. Hi, everyone. It is an honor to join you today to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing at LIRS towards rolling some of these practices out. And where I'd really like to start is by talking about the elephant in the room that is often very present with those of us that have drank the Kool-Aid and are all about monitoring and evaluation and love it, but we're often in a room with staff that is a mixed bag. There's staff that say, yes, this is great and wonderful, however, I don't have time for it, and staff that's really skeptical of it. So the first thing I really wanted to address and talk about is overcoming M&E stigma and barriers. And just being forthcoming with, this could be organizational culture, a lack of understanding when it comes to reluctance to share information. Sometimes it's failures are punished by donors, and so one may not want to share information about monitoring and evaluation for fear that funding will be cut. Sometimes program staff are unable to collect the data from partners. This is especially relevant with caseworkers working with refugees and wanting to collect higher outcome level data, but being bogged down with the requirement of collecting kind of low level input and output level data. Knowing the reasons that individuals don't want to share data will allow you to develop a capacity building approach and a theory of change strategy that addresses these issues and creates buy-in. Because let's face it, without the buy-in, the frameworks really won't take off. It really does take the whole team to use these tools, to use the theory of change, and to be able to continually track and use the work for management decisions, for decision making. And when it comes to influence of the past, also talking about that, being very open and having a conversation. There is a past or present culture of needing to be careful of what information is shared. Is that a culture where you are of this carefulness of information sharing? Previous culture of reporting that was too strenuous and not useful, is that in existence? In places where the answer is yes, individuals are often very hesitant to participate. How do you overcome that? And then really looking at influencing behavior, right? So having a real emphasis on learning versus accountability. How is M&E really about us learning internally so that we can do the work that we're so passionate about, emphasizing learning and the value of it over the reporting. And being intentional and clear, state our intentions clearly. How is this results framework going to be used? How are we going to use these indicators? Especially when you have a headquarters to implementer partners, sometimes implementers feel like, well, this is yet another monitoring tool used more so in what Jaime referenced as, oh, this is how the donor or the ORR is going to use this to kind of police us, right? And being really clear that that's not what you're about, and making very clear distinctions between the measures that are looked to measure success or learning opportunities of the work and reporting requirements versus the measures that you set internally for very specific learning purposes that will have consequences for you as well as for those that you work with. And so what I want to talk about and take us through is the process at LIRS that we have taken so far. So this is the process at a glance, right? We will look at the different parts of the process at LIRS and break it down to, defining key terms, drafting the narrative, the diagram that we refer to as a results framework, right? Because of my background and my past, it's just an easier reference point, and then rolling it out. So this is kind of the process. So let's start with defining key terms. There's industry-wide terminology around this work, as defined by the White House Task Force, RCUSA, the UN, etc. So the questions that I started to ask is, well, what was going to be our definition? How do we define and do protection, stabilization, integration, etc.? How do we define these terms? What are our organizational goals, and how do we then align the work that we're doing and the many programs and projects that we may have in our portfolio with accomplishing our organizational goals? What does success of a project look like? Describing that. And then after defining terms, we could then begin to draft a theory around it, because there was a need for a commonality, a common understanding around certain terminology, especially when it's so key and integral to the theory of change itself. And so what are key terms we use and how do we understand them? So then step 2 started with drafting the theory of change narrative. So the process of this was really asking who needs to be in the room for this? Who needs to participate? How many people should participate? Creating expectations for the working sessions and identifying what will come out of each stage of drafting the theory of change. So stage 1 for us was the narrative theory. It was looking at what was already in existence, what did the organization already have, doing an inventory, pulling those things together to inform a draft, and then bringing that draft to the key players inside the organization to test the theory. To look at the assumptions, to test the definitions, and refine and revise until we could have ownership of it together. Stage 2 was developing results and indicators, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And stage 3 was looking at the risks, the mitigations, how do we mitigate certain risks, and then any unintentional consequences. And then asking, what is the purpose? And what do we need to be successful in this process? So that's another part of this step when we get together. What's the purpose and what do we need to be successful in this process? Emphasizing that it's an iterative process, that it's not, okay, this is it and this is what, we can't change this once we finalize it, but recognizing that we will tweak it. We will, as we learn from it, we should be tweaking it. My role really was to facilitate. It was about generating the information the program staff have and then asking questions to test assumptions, identify what is within manageable interests, and really tease out any underlying causes. Grounding this work in lessons learned, grounding the theory in, okay, so we've done this work for how many years, what have we learned over time? And really looking to partners who are implementing it from day to day, what have they learned about this? And the other part of this was definitely creating a problem tree to really look at what is our causal logic at the different levels. So we can't just, the day-to-day work doesn't always equate to, or one project doesn't always equate to meeting our goal if our organizational goal is a 5 to 7 year goal. So where do we need to start? What results do we need to achieve within our first year of kind of really implementing our theory of change to 2 years, to 3 years, to 4 years out, and so on. And going up that diagram in our results framework to really achieving our goal ultimately. And the invert of that being, well, what are the problems that we have identified at each level that the results really address? So let's look at step 3. So this is where we moved to developing a results framework. And it was definitely rooted in the problem tree analysis. So results should correlate to the problems identified and how the organization is and will address these problems at different levels. It's the thinking through the theory of change diagram, through the results framework. So one thing that I wanted to talk about is one of the examples of this is our Refugee Mobile pilot project. And this is a pilot project in partnership. We are a small partner. It's us, it's one of our partners on the ground that's actually doing the phenomenal work. There's a technology partner, there's a university partner that is doing the impact evaluation component of this. So there are many different actors, and the project is using cell phone app technology to provide access to basic resources to a sample group of refugees. And so one of the things we did was we brought all the actors together in a room and really started to look at, do all the partners agree on how this process will work and should work? And we worked together on a problem tree, and this helped to bring everyone onto the same page. You know, one of the fun activities we did was I asked the group of the different partners to get together and together draft a headline of that after the project was over, after the pilot was over, what would a newspaper headline read that would indicate success? And it was really interesting to see how different actors would put a different spin on that headline based on their vested interest in the project, and coming together to some sort of commonality of defining what success would really look like. Working together on the problem tree also helped to bring everyone on the same page and helped people to identify, well, what problem and at what level are we really? Where can we contribute, and how far can we bring this in terms of where can we not contribute, and what results can we, what really correlations would be a real jump, right? Where will this project not? There won't be, it's not within our manageable interest to say we've helped to achieve X, right? And so really scaling our problems and scaling our results framework to this project level. And then it was great together to have every partner in the room to really identify the results as well as the indicators needed to test feasibility of what could and could not be collected as far as data in terms of the staff and the budget available for this. Simultaneously, besides the Refugee Mobile example, we began to also build results frameworks for existing ongoing projects within the organization and align any indicators used for external reporting with those used for internal learning. So step 4 was the key, right? And this is kind of where we are, and because of how we're doing this, we're actually doing multiple steps at once. So there are some organizational goals that we've completed our theories of change for, and there's others that we're still working at completing. So we're at step 4 for a couple of them, and then we're at step 1 or 2 for a couple of others. And this is where we're really we're testing, you know, we're testing what we put together. And so what I always go back to is, if you build it, you have to test run it. The first step was to look back at what information we're already collecting, or what we think we're collecting, and where we have gaps. So incorporating existing measures, but also being very diligent about identifying where are the gaps, what information do we think we have, but really there's a gap in correlating what we're collecting to what that indicator really is. And the data really is a documentation. What are we actually documenting versus what documentation are we saying is used to measure progress towards a result, but it's really far-fetched. It's not well aligned. Identifying data sources and any problems with our data sources. For example, if we're tracking training and post-test scores from online training, how many times will we allow participants to retake an online post-test? Do we have aligned thinking across the teams as to the objectives of an online learning materials? So for example, is one of the points of an online learning module to take someone through an hour-long module so that they can actually fill out some sort of paperwork while they're taking that module, and therefore they're really, to look at a post-test wouldn't really make sense for that module because it's not serving, it's serving a different purpose, versus a module that says, okay, we just taught you how to use and enter information into this database, and we really want to test if you've picked up on that. And we want to see how you did on your post-test so that we can tell, one, if you've learned it, but two, how do we need to adjust the material so that we can make it better? So if you didn't learn it, we can improve it. What data is useful to inform progress towards our goals versus what data is used for day-to-day management of some of the staff work? Making the distinction clear so we don't get stuck spending a lot of time on input and output indicators and measures, but really focus on getting outcome data and planning on data collection at the outcome level. As new proposals come up, aligning indicators for funders with those the organization has identified, using the frameworks to guide what work we will do moving forward. Testing via creation of a dashboard where we track progress towards a few key indicators, and amending accordingly as we go. So the final piece of this is kind of a quick, is the results frameworks down, right? It's a quick and dirty checklist. So is it useful? Your organization can't take on everything. What will your piece be? Stick to that. We had to decide what we would focus on versus what we would leave to others. Limited. For it to be useful, it needs to be realistic, ambitious yet realistic. To collect good data on a handful of indicators takes a lot of time. From documentation and analysis, all the way through analysis, it takes time. We asked, is this indicator pertinent to the result and ultimately the goal? Does it tell us if we are making progress towards one of our organizational goals? And is this data reasonable? Is this data, can we expect our partners to collect it? And what can we collect directly? And then is it clear, right? So is the result clear? Is it a unidimensional result? So, you know, healthier, better educated people is not a unidimensional result, right? You're trying to measure health and education in one kind of clump. So you don't want to do that. So you want to create results that are along the lines of what Jaime was describing, using that SMART metric, right? And in that same measure, you want SMART indicators. Is it measurable? Is it logical? Is it clear? Does everyone have the same understanding of what it means and what you're measuring? And so that's kind of the quick and dirty of some of what we've been doing. And I will hand it back over to Jaime and Margaret.
Great, thanks, Kasia. I was hoping to hear from everyone who's on the call today what your questions might be about what Kasia and Jaime have had a chance to say so far. We've had a few come through that I'll get to now, but please don't hesitate to add additional questions now in the chat. So one question that might be one for Jaime, is what if I have an existing program that's already in place and I go back and map my theory of change and realize there are problems with the logic? How do I fix that for a program that is already in place, like you mentioned?
No, that's a great question, and I think this, could be one that people would face quite a bit if they were doing this retroactively. And my answer to this is that if you're noticing huge logic problems with your current programming or gaps in services, then it's worth revising your theories of change. Theories of change for the project level, and also at the organizational level, like Kasia was talking about, really should be living documents, living maps. They should be revised over time. If you are, if you're proposing if you're in the process of looking at your project and developing your theories of change as part of a new funding period, then maybe you can make the adjustments as part of your new proposals. But if you're in the middle of your implementation and you're starting this process and you're noticing these gaps, it might be worthwhile to discuss with your donor and see where there might be flexibility if you need to add additional activities, if you need to make adjustments, and maybe it's not possible within that current funding period. But again, you can put it forward for the next. The other piece is that where there are strict donor required activities and indicators and all of these things, or if the theory of change that is sort of underlying your project but hasn't been explicitly stated, if it isn't working but it's what the donor is requiring, it can help to go back to, once you've mapped it all out, you can do some advocacy to some extent with donors, and of course it's best done as a community of refugee service providers. But it's also an opportunity, if you're saying the evidence is actually showing us, now that we're looking at the evidence is actually showing us that we should be doing this type of activity as opposed to this one. There is an advocacy work that can be done there in the process of refining your project theories of change.
Great, thank you. One other question, and I think this one might be a good one for Kasia. When you talk about bringing everyone to the table, how do you address disagreement between staff, donors, partners, when there is a disagreement about what's actually important with limited resources?
That's a great question. I think step number one is acknowledging that people do have different vested interests, right? And I think the best place to actually start is, where do you agree, right? It's so funny because by nature, I can focus in part of this work, right? As I can focus in on all the things that are wrong and not working, but focus on the agreement points. Can something be better? Absolutely. So you're working in the same direction, focused on what you agree on, look for solutions that work for everyone. And they do exist, right? There may be compromise in some places, and also striking the balance. There may be compromises where there will be some things that you absolutely do have to do for donor purposes because of what they need to continue to get money from Congress or government or private ... or to fulfill their own mission, but then balancing that with, well, what can you do internally aside from what is required for them that will still meet your need? Look for solutions that work for everyone in that way. And it's about managing perspective and kind of looking at, okay, what are the different approaches to this? And recognizing that there may be more than one, and really creating an environment where people can freely speak. And this is the hard part, right? Depending on who's facilitating the session, like if the funder is facilitating a session, it can be very intimidating for the fundee, the people receiving the money, or the partners that are maybe twice removed, that are sub-grantees, to feel safe, so to speak up. One thing I always, as someone who's worked with funders in the past, I encourage funders to really empower and hand over facilitation to a third party or to the actual partners on the ground to really facilitate that process. And then having the right people in the room that will be willing to take the risk and speak up. So I hope that helps to answer the question.
Great, thank you. I think so. One question from the almost from a business development perspective, what is the role of this type of planning at the proposal stage when we all know time is really tight and you're submitting a proposal? Maybe a question for, I guess, maybe for Kasia.
Yeah, sure. I think it's funny, some of it is, and we've done some of this recently, some of it is really having the foresight to know, hey, we all know when some of these, for some of the proposals, right, we all know where some of them are coming out. And really the great part is what Jaime said, if you have a results framework and you've done it, whether or not it's necessary for a proposal or for ongoing work, you can lift it. Like you can lift pieces of that and build it in to your proposal. When you're looking at your win themes, when you're drafting your proposal, you can lift what you've already articulated. So if you've articulated a theory of change and you know what you believe and what your organization has done that works to accomplish X, it's literally lifting that and dropping it in and lifting those indicators that you've maybe internally designed or adding them as illustrative indicators in addition to the ones that are already required. Sometimes that will come out in an RFP or a request for proposal from a foundation or fill in the blank potential funder that will be imposed by them of, hey, these are the requirements. And sometimes you get to actually suggest that.
And I can jump in here too, thinking about the IRC. We also have sort of high-level organizational theories of change in place, and those they don't go all the way down to the activities and outputs that we'd want to achieve. But like Kasia said, they do provide that guiding initial starting point from which you can start developing project-level theories of change. So they're great initial starting points for being able to lift some of that information, but the project teams would still need to be thinking about their own context, thinking about what activities are most needed to respond to the needs of clients, of their particular clients, what makes most sense for them, and develop their own project level theories of change. So taking those organizational ones and bringing them down to the project level and adapting them for that. The other point to make is that developing a theory of change, I mean, it can be a really long, drawn-out process, particularly if you're doing it for an entire organization. But when you're developing a project one, I mean, it can also be a very quick process. You can map out with your project team in an afternoon or in an hour even, very quickly, a basic drawing or illustration of what your theory of change is, just to make sure. I mean, it might not be super comprehensive, but it at least makes sure that you're starting to ask the right questions and making sure that what's going into your proposal, into your project, in the project design part of your proposal, that the logic is there and that you're not missing any key steps.
Thanks both of you guys. One maybe more question for Kasia as well. You mentioned partners. Do you have tips for holding partners accountable to make sure data is consistent across different program sites or different partners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think first, a great place to start is expectations. So if this is something that you're incorporating that has never been an expectation, really going in and pulling them into the process. Again, that's one of the things we've done, right? Is saying, okay, we're not just going to go in and say, hey, here's the 20 new indicators you need to collect information on. It's going in and saying, here's what we're thinking. Are you able to do this? How can we work to do this together? And having a dialogue so they have input and very much have say in what those indicators will be and what data they can and cannot collect. And there will be a healthy tension in that conversation, right? So some partners may say, we can't collect any of this. Are you kidding me? And then you have to kind of push back a little bit sometimes and come to a healthy middle ground, right? Providing tools. If it's ultimately up to you to have this data, it's providing useful tools and templates to make their lives easier. So, you know, one best practice is don't just communicate indicators and the tools to collect the data in as easy and as a kind of smooth way as possible. And that way, if you have a template, you would then not only share the template with one, but with all of your implementing partners and say, hey, you know, this is something that we would like for you all to collect. This is why we think you can collect it. This is how we think you can collect it. And here is a quick and useful tool that you can drop this information into for us. Please let us know if you have any questions. And when questions come up, not having just one-off conversations that will take you forever. Let's say you have 45 partners. You can't have a conversation with each partner separately. Pull everyone in together. As certain questions come in, give it a week maybe, and then pull everyone together and say, okay, there's some questions that have come in around this. We want to have a quick conference call with all of you, or we want to meet with all of you if you're all in the same geographical area, and really get on the same page of how this will be used, why we are using it, is it a requirement or is it being used for learning, and how can we scale it if we need to so that we can all be collecting the same thing in the same way.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for your questions. As we're getting up to the hour mark here, I'll move on to mention those resources that Jaime spoke about a little bit earlier. On our website, which is metasupport.org, we have a tip sheet summarizing all of the tips that Jaime mentioned, all 8 tips she mentioned earlier. And we also have some templates for developing those log frames, as well as a case study that illustrates the process similar to what Kasia talked about of working together as a team to refine and to develop and refine a log frame. We'll also we have recorded this webinar. We'll post that as well at metasupport.org, and you can access that via the M&E Technical Assistance page under webinars. Everything on the Meta website is something we'd love to hear your feedback on, not only in addition to the webinar survey we'll mention in a second, but if you have comments about the webinar topic, about the resources we're sharing, we would love to hear from you at meta@rescue.org. Specifically, please take a moment to provide feedback on today's webinar. I'll drop the link right now into the chat for everyone. It's very brief. It would be fantastic for us to monitor our project to get a little bit of your feedback. So I've entered that into the chat, and I'd like to as well thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope you can join us on the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone. And if you do have any questions, follow up, please do email us at meta@rescue.org.